Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to be here today. Thank you for joining us to commemorate the SS St. Louis. Remember that if you missed any of our recent events and presentations, you can still watch them on HIAS Pennsylvania's YouTube page, which is on our website at www.hiaspa.org. Becca will put that in the chat, and in the video section of HIAS PA's Facebook page. My name is Cathryn Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania. We're a nonprofit whose mission is to provide immigration, legal, and social services to immigrants and refugees. I want to, before we get started, particularly thank Devira Siegel and Bradley Bridge for their contributions to this event. We wouldn't be here without them, so we're very excited to be here. We're speaking with Professor Paul Finkelman. Paul Finkelman is the Chancellor and Distinguished Professor of History at Gratz College, the oldest independent Jewish college in America. From 2017 to 2021, he served as president of the college. Before coming to Gratz, he held the Fulbright Chair in Human Rights and Social Justice in the University of Ottawa. He has held endowed chairs at Duke Law School, LSU Law School, Albany Law School, and Tulsa Law School, and taught in the history departments at Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Texas, and Virginia Tech. He is a nationally known scholar and the author of more than 50 books and 200 scholarly articles. His most recent major book, Supreme Injustice, was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. Professor Finkelman will be discussing the history of the SS St. Louis and its impacts on immigration today. He will be speaking for the first half of the program. There will be time for question and answer and more of a discussion towards the end. So as you think of questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Finkelman. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And first of all, I want to thank HIAS PA for all of the wonderful work that you do, helping immigrants and taking care of people who come to the United States is perhaps the noblest thing that people can do. I am, of course, like so many people here, the grandchild of 4 immigrants. And so I greatly appreciate what HIAS does. I also want to say something just personal, which is that I got an email today from a man named David Schwager, who told me that he is the grandson of 2 people who were on the St. Louis and then were able to come to the United States, and that he and his sisters Harriet and Renee are going to try and be here. So if you are, I'm honored that you've come to hear this talk. Before I get to the St. Louis, it's important to talk about immigration in the United States, because we can't understand the events of the St. Louis without putting them into a historical context. In the colonial period, American immigration was pretty much wide open. You could get on a ship and go to one of the American colonies. Some of them would warmly welcome you as another immigrant. Others didn't want you because some of the colonies had fairly strong limits on religious liberty. So, for example, early Massachusetts didn't want anybody who wasn't a Puritan, although they had to accept Anglicans. Maryland was willing to accept Protestants and Catholics. They weren't so happy when Jews arrived. But by the time of the Revolution, American immigration was very much wide open. People came to all the colonies, and Jews came to the American colonies in small numbers in the 1600s and a few more in the 1700s. In 1684, the new royal governor of New York, New York had been a Dutch colony until 1664. 1684, the new governor of New York arrived, and he surveyed his domains, this colony and city that he's going to be the governor of. And he writes back to England and he says, "Here be not many of the Church of England, a few Roman Catholic, abundance of Quakers, preachers, men and women especially, singing Quakers, ranting Quakers, Sabbatarians, anti-Sabbatarians, some Anabaptists, some independents, some Jews. In short, of all opinions, there are some, and for the most part, none at all. And in some ways, that would describe much of America, especially New York City and later Philadelphia, as people of many different faiths trickle in and come to the New World. Jews trickle into Pennsylvania, they trickle into South Carolina, they come to New York, they come to Rhode Island. These are places where they are welcomed. In 1740, England passes a law allowing Jewish immigrants to become naturalized citizens of the colonies they move to. If they move to England, they can't become naturalized citizens. England doesn't allow a Jew to naturalize, but it does allow it in the colonies. And Jews hold public office in the colonial period. In the 1740s and 50s, there are a string of Jews who are elected to public office in New York. On the eve of the revolution, a Jewish man is elected to the South Carolina Provisional Legislature. He is probably the first Jewish legislator, not only in the New World, he's probably the first Jewish legislator in the entire Western world. Because of course, in Europe, Jews can't vote, they can't hold office, nor for that matter can they serve as officers in the army. Unfortunately, this particular man, Francis Salvador of South Carolina, gets elected twice to the provisional legislature, and then he's killed in battle fighting Tories in South Carolina. During the revolution, one Jewish man becomes a full colonel, which is the third highest rank in the army in those days. A number of Jewish men become lieutenant colonels, majors. Major Solomon Bush of Pennsylvania becomes the adjutant general of the Pennsylvania militia. His brother Lewis is killed in battle at Brandywine. This is extraordinary. There aren't Jewish officers in the British Army, the French Army. There are, of course, no Jews in the Spanish or Portuguese armies. There aren't Jewish officers in the Russian army. So immigration is part of the American process. However, after the Constitution is written and political parties develop, people begin to be concerned about immigration. So that in 1798, Congress passes a law changing the residence requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. And doing everything they can to prevent immigrants from coming, because the majority of the Congress, the Federalist Party, is fearful that if immigrants come, they'll vote for their opponents. In 1798, Congress passes something called the Alien Friends Act. It's actually not very friendly because it allows the president to deport immigrants without any hearing or due process whatsoever. And if they don't leave, they can be sent to jail for up to 3 years. It also passes the Alien Enemies Act, which allows the government to arrest and incarcerate anyone who might be a citizen of an enemy nation, even if they have fled that enemy nation to come to the United States. These acts disappear with the election of Thomas Jefferson, and except for the banning of free blacks from coming into the United States, there is almost no limitation on immigration until after the American Civil War. In the 1880s, Congress passes something known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which doesn't actually exclude all Chinese, it only excludes Chinese laborers. And so what we begin to see is the first implication that social class, money, education has something to do with immigration. But at the same time, the 14th Amendment has been ratified, which says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to their jurisdiction are citizens of the US and the state in which they live. By the way, the subject to jurisdiction means that the children of diplomats are not citizens, because diplomats have diplomatic immunity and therefore are not subject to the laws of the United States. But otherwise, what the 14th Amendment says is, if you are born here, It doesn't matter how you got here. It doesn't matter how your parents got here. Being born in the United States makes you a citizen of the United States. The Supreme Court confirms this in 1891 in a case known as Wong Kim Ark, in which the child of Chinese immigrants left the US, went back to visit his family in China that he'd never met because he'd been born in the US. When he came back, the immigration people wouldn't let him in, saying Chinese can't immigrate. He said, I'm not Chinese, I'm American. Supreme Court agreed. In 1903, Congress passes the Anarchist Exclusion Act to prevent anarchists from coming. So we now begin to get a political test on who can come. There are a few other tests, people with epilepsy, beggars, prostitutes, professional prostitutes are not allowed to come into the United States. People with bad eyesight are not allowed to come into the United States. I will tell a very quick personal story. My grandfather had what is known as watery eyes. His eyes were always watering. He always had to wipe the water out of his eyes. Turns out it's a relatively benign phenomenon, but he didn't know this. He knew that if you had, quote, bad eyes, you couldn't come into the US. And so my grandfather went from Romania to Hamburg, to Liverpool, to London, learned English, worked in New York and England for a couple of years. Then he went to Halifax. Then he went to Montreal. And from Montreal, he took a train to Plattsburgh, New York, on the border of New York and the Canadian province of Quebec, and crossed in as a tourist. Went to New York, where the rest of his family was, stayed there for a year, way longer than a tourist is supposed to stay. Got enough money to see an eye doctor. Eye doctor said, you're fine. He then took a boat out to Ellis Island and immigrated. So you are looking at the grandson of an illegal, undocumented alien. Under today's American law, my grandfather would have been expelled, and who knows what might happen to me. That's the changing immigration laws. In 1907, Congress tries to prevent Japanese immigration. They, after all, are not covered by the Chinese Exclusion Act. It fails. And then we have World War I. And at the end of World War I, we begin, actually during World War I, begin to see a real change in immigration law. The Immigration Act of 1917 bans Asians and other non-white people from coming to the US. Congress passes a act which says that people in certain parts of the world are, quote, undesirable. They can't come in. And then in 1923, we get the Emergency Quota Act. The quota is based on 3% of a country's population that is in the United States in 1910. So whatever, for example, the Italian-born population of the US was in 1910, 3% of that number can come in under the 1921 Act. And then we get the much more severe 1924 Act, the Johnson Quota Act, which reduces the percentage, reduces the total number of immigrants, and bases the percentage of what countries can come in, not on 1910, but on 1890. And what that means is that there is a tremendous discrimination against people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which would mostly include Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, Greeks, people from the Ottoman Empire, and Jews from all over Eastern Europe, because they come on under these national origin quotas. Why do we get this? Because the Congress has been taken over by very conservative, anti-immigrant Republicans. They want to make America into the Protestant nation that they think it should be. There's a marvelous debate on the floor of the House of Representatives between a Southern congressman who says that only people from Anglo-Saxon origins, that is from England and Wales and Scotland, should be able to come in, because they're the only true white people in the world, and a German American from Wisconsin who says, no, 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 we Germans are just as white as you people of English ancestry. On the floor of the House is Congressman Fiorello Laguardia of New York. Laguardia is always known as the Italian congressman, but in fact, his mother's Jewish. So technically, LaGuardia is Jewish. He's Jewish Italian. He gets up and he says, I want the gentleman from, I think it was Georgia and Wisconsin, to understand that when your ancestors were trying to figure out how to domesticate pigs, my ancestors were building the Colosseum and the roads in Rome and in Italy, and that we are as civilized as your ancestors ever would have been. He doesn't change anybody's mind, but it's a great rhetorical score. By the way, one of the reasons why they push for this immigration law is because when World War I started, we gave IQ tests to all soldiers. And they use the IQ tests to prove that you can't let immigrants in because immigrants are stupid. And because they're stupid, because they're dumb, we don't want them. The third lowest scoring group were African Americans. Most of them came from the South, where they got very poor education or no education. They were third from the bottom. Second from the bottom were Italian immigrants. And the worst scores, the dumbest people in America, were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Why did they do so poorly on the IQ tests? Just like the Italians, just like the African Americans, because most of them couldn't read English yet, and the test was given in English. So with this kind of evidence, we get the law that stops immigration. And in this immigration law, there is no such thing as a refugee status. There's no such thing as the president having the right to waive the immigration quota. Each country is given a quota. The entire United States is given a maximum number of immigrants you can have. But if England doesn't fill its quota, you can't shift the quota to somewhere else. And by the way, both the American Federation of Labor and the Ku Klux Klan support this law for different reasons. American Federation of Labor because they think immigrants will lower wages. Ku Klux Klan because they hate people who aren't like them. There is, in fact, no notion of refugee status in American immigration law until the 1956 Hungarian Revolution against the Soviets, when we let these poor refugees from communism come in. And then in 1961, we let refugees from Castro's Cuba come in. And finally, in 1965, under the Hart-Celler Act, we changed American immigration to what it is today. I should note that Emanuel Celler, co-author of this law, had been in his first term in Congress when the 1924 Act was debated. Celler serves in Congress for 49 consecutive years. And Celler represented a Jewish district from New York City, and he had fought against the 1924 Act. He fought against immigration quotas during the 1930s, lost. Finally, he wins in 1965. So what happens under the 24 Act? The 24 Act sets quotas, and this is where the St. Louis becomes important. The quota for Germany is 25,957 people a year. After Germany annexes Austria, the Austrian-German quota is raised to 27,000 people a year. So if we think about the rise of Hitler in 1933, when there are somewhere around 500,000 Jews in Germany, at 27,000 a year, it would have taken 20 years for the Jews in Germany to be able to come to the United States under the quota that is set. But the quotas are not always filled. And one of the reasons why they're not always filled is because initially the State Department is populated by bureaucrats, many of whom are flagrantly anti-Semitic. So they don't help Jews get visas. They don't want Jews to get visas. And so for the first few years of Hitler's reign, the German quota is never filled, even though there are huge numbers of Jews who have signed up to get a visa. They can't get a visa. Now, one of the problems with getting a visa, of course, is that it's not simply applying for a visa. You have to get all kinds of paperwork in. You have to have a birth certificate. You have to have a certificate from the local police force that you've never been arrested. You have to prove that you can support yourself if you come to the United States. To give you an idea of the dramatic change in this, between 1900 and 1915, an average of 910,000 people came to the US. Over 1 million came in 1905, 1906, 1907, 1910, 1913, 1914. From 1915 to 1924, there's an average of 450,000 a year. That includes all of World War I, and it includes the first years of the first Immigration Act of 1921. In 1924, the new Immigration Act has a total of 164,000 people a year that can come into the United States. When we think of 6 million Jews killed by Hitler, we realize that they could not come to the United States because American law did not allow that many people to come to the United States, even if there had been no national origins quotas. But as I said, in 1933, the quota for Germany is only 25,000. 1934 through 37, the average number of visas given to Germans is 7,000 a year. There are 18,000 visas that aren't issued. So this is the crisis that the United States and the world faces. Meanwhile, the rise of Hitler leads to huge number of Jews trying to leave Germany, not trying to leave other European countries because it's happening in Germany. It's not happening where we are in Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia. Well, it happens in Czechoslovakia when Germany takes it over. But in other places, but from Germany, it's very hard to get to the US. The US government has its hands tied. The law says you can't let more than 27,000 Germans in, and they all have to fulfill all the requirements of getting a visa. In the summer of 1939, it's estimated that there are 5,000 to 6,000 Jewish refugees already in Cuba. The Roosevelt administration, which can't get Congress to change the law, does everything it can to get Cuba to open up immigrants. So that, for one thing, Roosevelt lowers the tariff on Cuban sugar, which he does have the power to do, as a way of essentially bribing Cuba to let more Jews in. And that sets us up for the St. Louis. The St. Louis is a ship that comes to Cuba. It leaves Hamburg on May 13th, 1939. It has over 900 Jewish refugees on it. Most of them think they have a valid visa to come to Cuba. It turns out that most of their visas are not valid, and only a few of their visas are valid to stay in Cuba. The ones that do have a valid visa, it's only as a tourist, which means they can't stay very long. It arrives in Havana. There are 22 people with valid Cuban immigration visas, and a total of 28 are allowed to land. 2 other ships arrive from Germany, again with Jews from Germany. They simply go back because they realize they can't get off the boat. And that begins the saga of the St. Louis. It sits in Havana Harbor, then it leaves Havana Harbor and kind of sails kind of towards Florida, but never reaches Florida, doesn't want to reach Florida because they know they can't come to the United States. Meanwhile, Jewish leaders in the United States begin to work to get Cuba to let these people stay. And this leads to what is quite frankly the most tragic aspect of this story. A man named Lawrence Berenson arrives in Cuba. He's a Harvard-educated Jewish lawyer. He represents something called the National Coordinating Committee for Refugees, and he also represents the Joint Distribution League, known to all Jews in those days as simply the Joint. And he negotiates with Cuban officials to try and get the Jews to stay. He's close friends with the Cuban strongman Batista, who is not technically the president of the country, but really is in charge. And Batista, who had helped let these other 5,000 to 6,000 Jews come in, says, I don't want any part of this ship. It's too public. It's a problem. So he goes to the president of Cuba and he negotiates with the president of Cuba. And the president of Cuba says, look, if they will pay $500 per person plus $150 for expenses, I will make sure they all have a visa to come. The joint distribution in New York tells Berenson, we'll come up with the money. These are people's lives that are at stake. Berenson, who I would say is an arrogant Harvard-trained lawyer who thinks he's smarter than everybody else, thinks that he can talk the Cubans down. And so he doesn't take the offer. And he meets with the president of Cuba. And the next day, the president of Cuba issues the following statement. Agreement, 2 days later, agreement was reached 2 days ago with Senor Berenson to land the exiles on the Isle of Pines after he deposited $500 in cash per person with a subsidiary guarantee with regard to their food and lodging. He was given 48 hours to meet those requirements. Yesterday, Senor Berenson made an alternative proposal, and we have rejected his alternative proposal, and the 48 hours is gone. And we will no longer have our generous offer of allowing these Jews to stay. And so they go back to Europe. Could they have come to the United States? Only if President Roosevelt was simply willing to flagrantly violate American law, because American law says you can't come in without a visa. There's a visa quota. In 1939, the entire German quota is filled. And there are people waiting for visas in Germany. And many people in the United States, including Jews, say, you know, there's a problem with allowing these people on the St. Louis to jump to the head of the line. There are people in Germany who've been waiting 3-4 years for a visa. They've got one. Why should these people jump ahead of the line just because their ship happens to be there? It's horrible. And by the way, most newspapers in the United States commiserate with these Jews. They think it's awful what's happening to them. But the majority of newspapers in the United States, opinion polls all say the majority of Americans do not want to change the immigration law to let more Jews in. After Kristallnacht in 1938, when Jewish synagogues are burned and Jews are beaten up, more than 60% of the people in the United States said we should not allow more Jews to come in to the United States. One of the problems with democracies are that when the majority of the people have bad ideas, those bad ideas stay as law. The US does what it can in Latin America, but in 1939, Mexico caps German immigration at 5,000, and its preference is not for Jews, but German Catholics. A few thousand Jews come into Cuba after the St. Louis is gone. They come in quietly, they pay the $500 fee, they get in. Brazil bans Jewish immigrants in 1937, allows 538, and by 1942, probably about 20,000 Jews have gotten into Brazil. Argentina says it will take 5,037, but the next year it will only take 1,800. FDR personally asks the president of Paraguay to allow Jews to come in, and 5,000 are allowed in. Bolivia allows 20,000 Jews, about half of all Jews who go to Latin America. Meanwhile, and this is where we'll end the story, the St. Louis goes back to Europe, not to Germany. And again, if you've watched the movie about this, what is it? I can't remember the name of the movie, but you should
Voyage of the Damned. Yeah.
The Voyage of the Damned. Yeah. You should never get your history from movies. The Voyage of the Damned says most of these people are going to be killed. Not true. There is a play written some years ago where the playwright has a conversation between the black kid killed in the South, Emmett Till, and Anne Frank, where Anne Frank says they all went back to Nazi Germany and most of them died. None of them go back to Nazi Germany. They go to Brussels. They go to Belgium. Belgium takes some, Holland takes some, France takes some, England takes some. And of the 900 Jews who come to Europe, back to Europe, about 600 of them or more survive World War II. The rest are tragically caught in Belgium, France, and Holland, and some of them end up in death camps. I want to say one more thing and then we'll have questions. As we understand the St. Louis, we also have to understand the conditions of the United States in 1930s. In 1929, 3% of the US is unemployed, 1.5 million people. That's the year of the stock market crash. In 1930, 4.3 million, 8% of the US is unemployed. In 1931, with Herbert Hoover refusing to do anything to deal with unemployment, we're up to 8 million people, 15%. Franklin Roosevelt is elected president in 1932. 12 million are unemployed, 23%, but he doesn't take office in those days until March of 1933, by which time we're up to almost 26, 27%. More than 12, almost 13 million people are unemployed, 11 million unemployed in 34, 10 in 35, 9 in 36, 7 in 37, 10 million in 38, 9 million in 39. And in fact, the lowest percentage of unemployment between 1931 and the US entry into World War II is 14%. So Americans are saying, we feel very sorry for these Jews, but our people can't find jobs. Our factories are closed. And that's part of the problem. One more thing to think about. In 1933, when Roosevelt takes over, we have a $2 billion federal deficit. It goes to $3 billion in 34, $3 billion in 36. 2 billion in 39. This is a huge federal deficit. No one's ever seen deficits like this because we are fighting the Depression. So these are the social political conditions that lead to the tragedy that those on the St. Louis don't go to Cuba because of an arrogant guy who doesn't want to cut a deal because he thinks he can talk the president of Cuba down, and American immigration law that has closed the doors to these people. Let's take some questions.
Okay, thank you. And while I just want to remind everybody, you can put, excuse me, put your questions in the chat, or at the bottom of your screen, there's a reaction button and you can see a raised hand icon. So please feel free to do that. While we're waiting for people to think of their questions, I want to highlight Professor Finkelman's last point because it's really important. So remember that the St. Louis, as he pointed out, arrives in the United States against the context of huge unemployment because of the Great Depression. And yet, Today, we have the smallest unemployment rate that in in a long, long time, staffing crises in every industry, and there still is no political will for immigration. So that right there tells you something about whether the issue of employment and immigration is actually a myth or a fact, right? So,
Let me make a point on this, okay? Since World War II, immigration has been often about getting people to come to the United States to take jobs that Americans don't want, or because they are bringing great skills to the United States. So, one famous Jewish immigrant who comes is Albert Einstein. He brings great skills that everybody in this Zoom combined doesn't have his brain power. But in the 1930s, it's very much a heavy industry economy. It's still a farm economy with lots of farm laborers. And I think there's a real belief, right or wrong, that we can't afford to let immigrants come in. I want to, if I can, I want to say one more thing about popular will. One of my PhD students from Gratz College is on this call. She just finished a PhD in Holocaust and genocide studies. She wrote on how Maine reported the Holocaust. And I chatted with her briefly in the chat box before we began. And she says that Maine newspapers advocated allowing the St. Louis refugees to come in, but they would have been a huge minority. At this time, there's a survey. Should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles to come in from Germany? And 72% of the American people say no. They are not wanted. It's both anti-Semitism, it's a kind of racism, and it's what was called at the time America First, America Firstism. We only care about America. And that's the political problem that we faced.
And that we continue to face. So I want to take questions. Miriam Siegler had asked, the Yvonne conference was after the St. Louis. Dominican Republic was only country of 32 at the conference that allowed Jews in, but did that happen after?
I think the Evian conference is after, but again, one of the problems with all of this is we all view this from the perspective of the Holocaust. We view this from the perspective of Hitler's final solution. But we need to remember that in 1939, there are no death camps, there is no Auschwitz, there is no Belzec, there is none of these death camps have been built. World War II has not started yet. And no one imagines what is about to happen. In fact, the entire Jewish world breathes a great sigh of relief when the St. Louis lands in Belgium, because all of these Jews are now safe. They are now secure. They are living in free democratic countries. They don't face Nazism. No one knows that in 6 months, World War II will start. And in a year and a half, Germany will have conquered France and Belgium, most of France and Belgium and Holland, and the world will be very different. By the way, the Canadian government, when asked how many Jews Canada is willing to accept, the Canadian Minister of Labor, not the Prime Minister, but the Minister of Labor, famously says, none is too many. In fact, some do come to Canada, but very few.
So that answers one of the other.
And I should add one other thing. More Jews come to the United States in the 1930s than any other country in either the Western Hemisphere or in democratic Europe. That is, there are more Jews coming to the US than England, than France, than other countries. Not enough, but more than anybody else.
Mark Gilbert had asked, I know Gustav Schroeder was accused initially of supporting Nazi Germany, but the truth came from the passengers. Can you explain a little bit more about Captain Schroeder after the war?
You know, I really can't. I mean, I think Captain Schroeder did what a ship captain is supposed to do, which is to take care of his ship and to take care of his passengers. And he did what he was supposed to do. And I don't actually think that the German government cared much. They didn't certainly want these people to come back to Germany. Remember, Hitler's goal was to get all the Jews out of Germany. It's only later that he decides the way to do it is to murder them all. So Schroeder takes them to Belgium. Germans are fine with that. Now, the more interesting question is not what Schroeder is doing, but is the Hamburg America line, which is what the ship is on, has it been set up by the Nazi government to embarrass the United States? Because the Nazis have been sending agents into Cuba, starting anti-Semitic rumors, raising anti-Semitic claims, and then the ship comes and nobody can get off. And then the Germans are in the position of saying, see, we don't want the Jews, but neither does Cuba, neither does the United States, neither does Mexico, neither does Argentina. And so in that sense, the poor people on the St. Louis are caught in a tremendous political fraud. I think, and I don't know that everyone's ever figured this out, but I think it may have been a setup by the Nazis to embarrass the US.
That's pretty shocking.
Because we know there are a lot of Nazi agents in Cuba. And up to this time, some 5,000 Jews had come into Cuba and there hadn't been a problem. So why suddenly is Cuba changing its mind? Well, part of it is because the head of their immigration had just been arrested because he'd stolen something between $500,000 and $1 million, taking bribes to let people into the country. So there's just this, kind of perfect storm of events.
Okay, here's another question. I recall watching a movie in which a few children were let off the boat to enter Cuba. Was this accurate?
I gave the number of 28 people who get off the boat. Maybe there were a couple of children there. My advice generally is get your history from books, not from movies. Movies are meant to entertain you. Movies are meant to make money for the company that does the movie. And movie makers always play fast and loose with facts because facts don't always work for the narrative they want to have.
Another question, did any of the leading isolationists, such as Father Coughlin or Charles Lindbergh, comment at the time about the St. Louis situation?
They commented all the time about the fact that we don't want any more Jews in the country. They don't want any more immigrants in the country. It's not our problem. It's Europe's problem. We should mind our own business and worry about our own country and not worry about that country. And yes, there are a number of people who take that position. By the way, not virulently anti-Semitic, not openly anti-Semitic, but Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who will later, after the war, be known as Mr. Republican and expected to get the nomination for president in 1952, but Eisenhower got it instead. Robert Taft says it's too bad about these people, but we can't take them. We don't have room for them in our country. This is very much political. I mean, and it's, political parties are very different than today. But it's a coalition of Southern Democrats who only want white Protestants in the United States and Midwestern and Western Republicans who only want, white Protestants in the United States.
Of those Jews who returned to Europe, What factors determined who survived? Location, financial status, other?
Bad luck or good luck?
Mm.
So the Jews who go to England, every one of them survives the war except one man who was killed by the Blitz. So he's in London, he dies when the Germans are bombing England. So every Jew who got to England survived. The ones in France and Belgium and Holland, some of them are picked up by the Gestapo when those countries are invaded. Holland has a very high percentage of Jews who are captured and executed, sent to, murdered in camps. France has a relatively low rate. Lots of Jews survive in France. Belgium's kind of mixed. It's a matter of luck in part. It's also, I suppose, a matter of good health, because if you went to a camp and you were seen as an able-bodied worker, you might survive the war as a worker. I don't know it. And again, I have not studied every single person who was on the St. Louis. I suspect some of them went to Europe and immediately figured out how to get somewhere else, get to Spain, get to Portugal. Curiously, by the way, Spain, which had expelled the Jews in 1492, becomes a safe haven for Jews if they can get into Spain. Same thing with Portugal. So there are places where they can go. Turkey takes Jews. But, it's not easy to get from Belgium to Turkey, especially if you've lost most of your assets because you bought those tickets, which didn't get you anywhere.
Is it true that Batista demanded the gold from people's teeth in order to be admitted to Cuba?
No, I've never encountered that.
Okay.
And Batista actually didn't get involved in this. But Batista is like the Minister of Labor in Cuba, but he's really the guy who's running the show. And he feels that he's caught in a bind, because if he helps the St. Louis, it's going to cost him politically within Cuba. Even in a dictatorship, you still have to have some support of your people. And there are so many pushes for anti-Semitism in Cuba that Batista kind of lies low. And Berenson, who I mentioned earlier, was a friend of Batista. And Berenson had worked with Batista in getting other Jews in, getting those other 5,000 in. And after the St. Louis, Cuba will take a couple more thousand Jews. They don't want their teeth, they want money. And so, the president of Cuba says, give us $500 plus more money and we'll let everybody in. $500 a person.
Sorry, there's another really good question. Why do you think that the historic facts that you so clearly explained have been distorted?
Some of it's political. That is to say, there are some activists in the country who pretend to be scholars, who, for modern political reasons, do everything they can to undermine the reputation of Franklin Roosevelt. And so they claim that Roosevelt personally didn't want Jews to come in. The historical record is overwhelming that that's not true. And that he's working everything he can behind the scenes to find a place for the people on the St. Louis. He's also, by the way, working very hard for Congress to change the Neutrality Act so he can start loaning ships and other war material to England if a war breaks out. He's got a very big picture on his hand, and getting Congress to do that, getting Congress to implement the peacetime draft, getting Congress to get ready for a war that you can see is coming. is what's on his agenda. But I think there are people who do what they can to defame Roosevelt's reputation because they're Republicans and he's a Democrat. And I don't want to get into modern day politics today. I'll let people draw their own conclusions. There's also a desire to blame someone. We have to blame somebody for this. We can't say, well, the world is just sometimes an awful place. And we certainly don't want to blame the representative of the Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint. And we certainly don't want to represent the Jewish leaders, other Jewish leaders who come to Cuba and say it's their fault that the St. Louis people didn't get in. But the fact is, when we look at the record carefully, some of this is infighting between Jews. And I think some Jews simply don't want to say, well, we didn't get along. We had different strategies. We didn't all come together. You know, today, if there were a crisis like this, the heads of major Jewish organizations, which is an organization itself, would all get together in a room in New York. They'd figure it out, or Washington. They'd figure it out. They'd come up with a policy, and most people would sign on to the policy, and you would get the job done. And we don't get the job done. By the way, there are some Zionist groups in this period that are not interested in seeing Jews come to Cuba or the US. And they're only pushing for Jews to go to Palestine. So you got to blame somebody. And so you come up with these narratives. And sometimes, I mean, the most common narrative that's false is they all got sent to Germany. None of them go back to Germany. I have heard people say, well, they all were sent to Germany and immediately sent to Auschwitz, which would have been interesting because Auschwitz is a Polish military camp at this time because Poland has not been invaded yet. But this is what people either want to believe. It makes them feel better to believe these things than perhaps to believe that sometimes history just is awful. History is not pretty. Again, there was a rabbi who kind of dabbles in writing history and things about Jews. He wrote an article in a Jewish historical journal in which he said the majority of the people in the St. Louis were sent back to Europe where they died in camps. It's not true.
All right, I want to ask one more question, and then I want to kind of wrap up and connect those events to what's happening today.
Please.
So the last question, which is an excellent one in light of what you had said about the speculation regarding setting up the United States for humiliation. Do you feel the St. Louis was the catalyst Hitler used? If no other countries would take Jewish refugees, that was justification to move forward with the final solution?
Well, the final solution doesn't come about for almost 3 years. And quite frankly, Hitler doesn't need any justifications. Hitler has long before this justified in his own mind that the only good Jew is a dead Jew. And he would be happy to expel all the Jews from Germany after he takes everything he can steal from them. But if he has to kill them, it's not a problem. So I don't see this as Hitler saying, okay, now the United States is allowing me to have the final solution. Final solution is not on Hitler's mind yet. His mind is, let's get rid of the Jews. And by the way, Hitler is perfectly happy to deal with Jewish organizations that are willing to bribe Germany to let Jews out of Germany. But I think it's a great propaganda coup for him. And like any political leader, propaganda coups are wonderful. He can certainly go back to his own people and say, this justifies everything we're going to be doing. So somebody put in the chat that the Wannsee conferences in 1942, that's when the final solution is created. So this is not yet 1942. It's not even fall of 39 yet. But Hitler doesn't need a justification. He has it in his own, evil brain.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Finkelman. I think my biggest takeaway, I mean, you had said sort of several times and at several points along the discussion about how things are political and how things are caught in the crossfire of politics. And I think what I'm struck by in listening to that is how much politics really ends up being a code word for the agenda of powerful people that isn't generally related to the needs of the vulnerable. So, and in fact is usually in opposition to those needs. So I think it gives us a lot to think about, to hear kind of the real story, if you will, but doesn't change the fact, as we all pointed out, that here we are in many ways, what goes around comes around with the America First rhetoric. But at the same token, if you really look at the facts and the data about things like the economy and the labor force and the unemployment rate, we're really in a very different place. But we persist with the America First rhetoric and the exclusion of immigrants. We do so in not only in peril to those immigrants, but also in peril to ourselves. The period of isolationism that the United States went through in the past and is going through again never results in anything good. But we persist in not really learning from that history. So with that, I want to share one more comment in the chat from a listener, just because it's a positive note and a good one to end on. Susan Singer wrote, "My father of blessed memory was a baby aboard the St. Louis. Captain Schroeder was a true hero. Our family was saved because they were disembarked in London." So thank you for sharing that personal story and for reminding us. I think one last reminder, I know I said I was wrapping up, but I lied. One last reminder is that, as Professor Finkelman pointed out, so the good news is that, in fact, the majority of folks from the St. Louis, despite that harrowing journey, did end up surviving. The bad news, of course, are the 250 people that didn't survive. And the fact that, we have to remind ourselves, those that did survive, why did they survive? Because of the grace of other countries. And so from an American perspective, it should still be looked at as a shanda, regardless of the fact that people survived, because other countries stepped up. We didn't when people needed us. We did later, as Professor Finkelman pointed out, we did end up taking in the most Jews, and that is something to be grateful for and proud of. But taking in the most, I think, is sort of small comfort when we're turning away people that need us. It's not really a numbers game. It's a game of humanity.
Catherine, if I can respond to that briefly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what you're saying as an American is entirely true. That is, the shanda of the United States is that we turned our backs on refugees in 1924. And we lacked the political will and the political ability to change our mind. And we don't change our mind until 1965, which is a very, very, very long time. And that reminds us two things. One, it reminds us what you have said about the shanda, but it also reminds us about the value of democracy. Because in fact, in 1965, we did change our minds. And that has a lot to do with how people's minds are changed at the local level, it's a process. It's a process of why do I teach this stuff? When I went to get a PhD, my mother said, why don't you become a lawyer? You'll make more money. And she's right. Although I ended up being a law professor, but I wasn't a lawyer. But the point is that it's so important for us to constantly teach this, for constantly let people know what the past was, because this is how we learn from the past. We have to understand how we got to where we are. And we have to understand how important it is for an organization like yours, which, as I calculate, is about 140 years old.
That's correct. We were founded in 1882.
Yeah, so you're in your 140th year. That's pretty remarkable. That's astounding. And you're still doing what you started out to do. So I clap for you.
Well, thank you so much. I clap for everyone here and for you, Professor Finkelman. I hope that folks were as enlightened as I was, and I hope we all know now our marching orders are very clear. As Professor Finkelman said, the pendulum swung from 24 to 65. It took time. It was a process, but it was a good one. And the pendulum swung back from 65 to today. So it's time that we need to go back again. And so we need to work that process, which happens on the local level, which happens with all of us contacting our representatives and telling them that immigration is really, really important and a positive.
But by the way, one, and then we will, and then I will shut up. The modern evidence is very clear that immigration actually is an engine for growing the economy. It is not a drag on the economy. And immigrants tend to work very hard because they have to. And immigration has always been a way of building an economy. Although in the middle of the Great Depression, that might not have been the case, but we're not in the Great Depression, despite the fact that the stock market is not doing as well as we all wish it would.
That's right. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll join us for our next advocacy event. You'll sign up for our newsletter to find out about it. And thank you again for tuning in.
Thank you.